Hey everyone, in this video I want to explore Azure Policy remediation. I did a deep dive on the anatomy of Azure Policy a couple of weeks ago, and one of the areas I really didn't go into enough detail about was remediation. So the goal of this video is to really explore those modify and deploy if not exist effects that we can leverage. As always, a like and subscribe is appreciated. So if I think about an Azure Policy, remember at the foundation, we have this if, and then a set of conditions for when this policy applies. And then we have the then. What are we going to do if those conditions are met? And one of the big elements of that then is we have a certain effect. Now we have things like deny, audit, disabled. But some of those effects can actually perform remediation, i.e. change either the resource that is being deployed or maybe adding something, maybe an extension, some configurations that relate to that resource being deployed. There's also append. Append is really on the way out and it can't impact existing resources. So I'm really going to focus on that modify and deploy if not exists sets of effects. Now let's start off with greenfield, i.e. it's a brand new resource and what's happening and how these modify and deploy if not exist or dine effects actually work. So if we think about the elements involved, obviously a huge part of this always is we have the Azure Resource Manager. That's that entry point through all of our requests go. And then we ultimately have the resource provider that is powering and defines that resource we're trying to actually create. Maybe it's Microsoft.compute for virtual machine, Azure.storage if it's part of a storage account, etc. And then we have obviously the user. I'm going to draw the user in orange. And I can think about we're performing a deployment or an update to a resource. So as the user, I'm going to start off with this idea of I'm making that operation. And this is maybe a create. Maybe it's an update. So it's some operation I'm performing. Now remember, as part of the Azure Resource Manager, there are a number of elements that are always checked. And a huge part of Azure Resource Manager is this is where policy is enforced. There's no bypassing policy. If I'm doing it via the portal, if I'm doing a PowerShell command or the CLI or a template, it still passes through that template. And what I can think about happening is that maybe as the user, okay, I'm doing some deployment. This is the resource I want to create. And let's start off with the idea that the effect I'm going to use is modify. So in my template, I have some conditions. And then my effect, if those conditions are met, is I'm going to run the modify effect. Modify is super powerful when I want to change the resource that I'm deploying. So I want to change some, maybe it's tags on the resource I'm deploying. Maybe it's some other attribute. Now the attributes I can change with modify are listed in the documentation. And what it gives you is obviously it talks about, hey, things like tags, but then there's the command that I can run. And this will show me all the aliases available that are modifiable, i.e. I could change these using the modify effect. So you can go and look at that document to understand exactly, okay, these are the things I can modify. So your policy, and I'll show you one in a second, has a list of conditions. Okay, the resource I'm deploying meets those conditions, so then I have the modify effect. So what's happening at this point is my request, that request that I'm placing in, well, that request is modified by the policy. So whatever that change is added to the request, and then it goes on its merry way. It's sent to the resource provider. So that's how the modify is working. So at the time of the deployment, or the update operation, if the policy conditions are met, it has an effect of modify defined, it will actually change the request before it sends it to the resource provider. So if we go and look at a fairly simple one. So this is one for Azure File Sync. And as usual, we can see, hey, we have the if section, and it's saying all of these need to be true. So it's of type a storage sync service, for example, and the field incoming traffic policy does not equal allow virtual networks only. So hey, it's a storage sync service, but it has not configured this incoming traffic policy. Also then, we have this idea of the then block. My effect is a parameter, so I can pass the parameter when I assign this, but if we to go and look at the parameters, it can be modify or disabled, and the default is modify. So here we're taking the standpoint of, hey, it's modify. In the details, we have a role definition ID. So in this case, this is contributor. If we went and looked up what this is, so it's contributor permissions it needs. If there's a conflict, i.e. I have other policies that apply, what should we do? So it's going to do, in this case, an audit condition. There are other effects that come into play. And then my operation, well, hey, I'm actually going to go ahead and set a value of allow virtual networks only on this field incoming traffic policy. And I'm doing an add or replace. So here we can see I'm actually modifying an attribute of there. Another common example would be tags. So in this example here, once again, we have this idea of the if statement. So this time it's, hey, if a certain tag that I'm specifying does not equal a certain value I want, then I'm going to do a modify. Once again, I tell it the role definition I want. Again, in this case, it's contributor. It just needs to have a role that has permission to perform the modification you're asking for. And then we're doing an add or replace. We're either going to change the existing value to the one we want, or we're going to add it if it's not there for the value I'm passing. So this is modifying the request as it's actually sent from ARM to the resource provider. So that's modify. Okay, then we have the idea, a different effect, deploy if not exists. So I'm going to say dyn, deploy if not exists effect. This is fantastic for, hey, I'm deploying a resource and then I need something that builds on that resource. So I need the resource created first, then I want to go and look at what was created and then maybe deploy an extension, maybe install an agent, maybe configure these additional diagnostic settings or something like that. So modify is great when I want to change the resource being deployed. Deploy if not exists is great for doing some additional set of deployment. I'm going to run a template based on the resource I create. Now, when I have the effect of deploy if not exists, what actually happens is the original request is not modified. So it is sent to the resource provider as before. But then what I have is within this effect block, I can have things like existence conditions. So the if conditions still apply to say, well, does this policy apply or not? If it does, then, hey, I want to deploy if not exist. Well, when should I do that deploy if not exist? I can add these existence conditions to say, well, go and look at these attributes of what was deployed or some other scope. And then if they're not met, go and perform this other action. So with the dyn, it deploys it as is, and obviously that's going to end up with this resource being created. Then what happens is a get is performed, and then it's evaluated. So it then looks at, well, okay, what happens? The policy is going to go and look at it, evaluate against the existence conditions that I can specify as part of the deploy if not exists effect. And if they're not true, i.e. it's not met, well then what policy does is I've specified a template. as part of the deploy if not exists effect, not only do I have these existence conditions, I specify a template to go and deploy. So now what it will do is, hey, I have some template that I specified. So now there's going to be a template, a different template that will get deployed, which will then go and maybe, hey, create those extensions, deploy that agent, whatever the list of things I want to do. So the key point here, this is really they're all multi-stage processes. Even after this, there's then a check to say, hey, is it compliant or not? With this, obviously, hey, it deploys it, and there can be a wait time. So obviously, I need to let the resource get created. Then I can go and do the evaluation. I'll do a get. And then, hey, if it doesn't meet those existence conditions, then I'll go and perform the action I define, i.e. deploy a template. Now, there are various options around this. If we go and look at the documentation for deploy if not exists, it talks about the idea of obviously there's a type. So you have a name, a scope for that existence check, the evaluation delay before I go and check, after provisioning success, after provisioning failure. Then this big one is the existence condition, where this is what I'm going to go and look at to decide, well, do I go and perform whatever I'm going to perform? I deploy a template, the definition IDs of the roles I need, my deployment scope, and then the deployment itself, i.e. the template I actually want to push. And that's really the big deal around this. So let's go and look at one of these. So it's going to look again very, very similar. So this is deploying the log analytics extension. So as always, we have this effect, and my default is deploy if not exists, but I could say disabled. I don't do this. I have the same if. So this if is, hey, does this policy apply or not? So I have these list of checks. So is it a VM? And then, hey, is it certain types of image? So this is just, does this policy apply? If it does apply, then we have that standard then. My effect is going to be deploy if not exists, dyn. My type is, hey, it's going to be an extension. And then I have the role definition ID I need. And this is the log analytics contributor role. And then we see we have the existence condition. So this is now the resource was created, it did a get on it, and now it's looking for these things to all be true. Hey, it's got the Microsoft monitoring agent, it's got enterprise cloud monitoring as the publisher, and it succeeded. So if all of those are true, then the condition has been met, it doesn't do anything. But if any of them are not true, then it's going to go and do this deployment. In this case, it's going to go and deploy a template, and it's going to go and deploy the extension. So this is the idea of what it's doing. We have another one. Exactly the same idea. Diagnostic settings. So once again, we can see, well, we have the if. Hey, when does this policy apply? Well, basically, it's a key vault. And either the event hub location is blank, or this location equals event hub location I pass. So if I have any of these, this policy takes effect. So then my effect is, hey, I want to deploy if not exists. Once again, okay, the resource was created. So now I'm going to go and check for these things. I want all of these. Hey, I want to find, hey, these logs are enabled. Account is at least one, so there's at least one of these. And there's at least one of these metrics enabled. So if this is true, if there's at least one of each of these, it won't do anything. But if not, well, then I want this role definition, again, contributor, and I'm going to do a template deployment to go and deploy the diagnostic settings. So we can see exactly what it's doing as part of these. So that's the key structure to that. So it really is the same. It's just as part of the deploy if not exists effect, I can have these existence conditions that go and look at, hey, the resource that was created, does it meet these things? If it does, great, I don't have to do anything. But if it doesn't, well then go and deploy this template that I'm specifying. Now, As part of this, when I do an assignment of a policy that uses modify or deploy if not exists, it needs a managed service identity. Now, this can be a system assigned. It will create it for you automatically. Or it can be a user assigned, one I've created that I could then maybe use in multiple places. When we assign via the portal a policy with modify or deploy if not exists, it will go and look at those role IDs we specified as required and automatically grant them to that managed service identity. If we don't use the portal, then hey, we need to go and make sure we grant that the necessary permissions to do whatever job it's needed. If we were to jump over again and just look at these examples for a second, and let's actually assign one of these and we'll see this. So this is obviously doing a deploy if not exists. And what we'll see in the remediation tab, it's always going to create a managed identity. Because it's a deploy if not exists, it has to create a managed identity. But I do get the choice of should it be system assigned or a user assigned. If I went and looked at a modify example and did an assign, once again, I don't have a choice. It's always going to create a managed identity. But again, I could, if I wished, change that to a user assigned. So it's always going to have a managed identity. Why? Why do we need this managed service identity? So let's think back to the green field. I'm creating a new resource. Remember, there's a user doing this action who is authorized. And so when I do a modify, what's actually happening for a new resource, making this change, well, it actually gets submitted as the user. So it actually is using the user's identity there. So it's not using that managed service identity for the modify effect. So yes, it makes you create it, but it's really making you create it for in case I'm going to do this other thing I'm going to talk about down the line. What about deploy if not exists? Well, that's a trickier one. The deployment of the initial resource, that's done as the user's identity as well. And remember, that's not changed. That just happens as the user. But then remember, what has to happen is after that deployment is completed, it has to do a get and then submit this new template to modify it. Well, that is done as the managed identity for the policy. And that template is submitted as the managed identity. So even for a new resource, the managed identity is used when I have a deploy if not exists. So that's really a key point about that. So for the modify, it's actually not used. I have to create it, but that's really for something we're about to talk about. But the deploy if not exists, it's always used to go and get the resource and then do that template deployment to go and move or change whatever that set of resources is. So that's why we have it. But there's another bigger reason. When I perform an assignment of a policy to a certain scope, resource group, subscription management group, it doesn't impact existing resources that were already there. It's only now looking, hey, a create update comes through, hey, policy's going to check, and these things will happen. But it's not going to do anything for existing resources. So if I've already created these things, and basically I have this idea of, well, hey, they're existing, so these resources exist already. Policy doesn't do anything. If I just assign it to the scope, they're ignored. Okay? Well, they'll show as not compliant, but it won't remediate them. But I want that. I want this tag added. I want this agent deployed. So what I have to do is I have to basically create a remediation task. And when I assign a policy through the portal, it actually gives me the option of creating the remediation task when I do the assignment. It brings it nicely in together. And obviously, once I've assigned it, that remediation task will go and run, and I can specify the batches, how many at a time, how many resources, failure conditions. But then once it's caught them up, well, every other resource coming in will always now go through the policy, so future resources are okay. Well, so now if I think about existing, this is where this managed service identity always has to be used. So there's the idea that for both modify and deploy if not exists, well, I have to get the resource. Well, it uses the managed service identity if I do a modify. And it uses the managed service identity if I've got that template and I have to deploy it. So that's where the managed service identity is always leveraged. So for an existing resource that I choose to go and do a remediation task for, and you can see it right here. Notice when I'm doing this deployment, I have the option to create a remediation task. So in this one GUI experience, it will go and create that, so it will go and fix existing ones. If you don't create the remediation task here, what you can do is in policy, just go and look at remediation. It would show me resources that are not compliant for policies that have a modify or deploy if not exist effect. And from here, I could go and create the remediation task as well. So I could do it from this location. So I have two different ways. Obviously, I can do it through PowerShell, through AZ CLI, etc., as well. But that's why we have those managed service identities. So I always have to do it. If I have a policy and I'm assigning it, and it's got an effective modify, or it's got an effective deploy if not exists, dying, I have to create that managed service identity, either system assigned, it creates it for me, or user assigned. Through the portal, it will look at the role IDs I said is required for the effect and grant them automatically. There are a few exception circumstances, so check the documentation. If I'm not using the portal, I need to go and grant them. It just needs a role that has permission to do whatever this change is. The managed service identity is not used for new resources that have modify, but we still have to create it because it will be needed if we then go and do a remediation task. For deploy if not exists, it's always used. It's used to go and get the resource and then deploy the template. And that's the same for existing as well. For a modify of an existing, well, it has to run as some identity, and this user is not available anymore. So it has to use that managed service identity. So that's it. I just wanted to really go through and make sure it was clear about those remediations and what it can do. So it's all about, hey, we want to actually not only go and check, but maybe there are things we can do. Modify, fantastic for changing attributes of the resource we are deploying. Deploy if not exists, fantastic for, hey, I'm deploying a resource, then there is some other action I need to perform on that, like install an agent, add an extension, modify these diagnostic settings. So that's why I have those two things. Append cannot be used for remediation of existing, so it never uses a managed service identity. And again, append is really on the way out, modify is far more powerful. So that was it, and there's a lot of examples if you go and look just at the definitions that are built in. But I hope that cleared up the remediation, why we need that managed service identity and the roles it requires. Hey, it needs the roles for whatever these modify or deploy if not exists are actually doing. So that's it. I hope this helped a lot. And until next video, take care.